women in the American Revolution, putting the her in heroics. This was a labor of love because women are my favorite people, and they don't get a lot of historical notice in the broad sweep of the American Revolution. You know, we hear about Abigail Adams and Martha Washington and Thomas Jefferson's wife and so on, but it's the normal, everyday woman that we don't get to hear about. So that said, when I started this project, it was a little bit of a task to decide where I wanted to start. Should I talk about Molly Pitcher, some of the other names that you may know? But I decided to start with probably the most ubiquitous and most maligned category of woman in the American Revolution, what is commonly known as a camp follower, which was never really a term of art during the American Revolution. They were really known as the women of the camp. And here you see some images of artistic impressions and live shots of women participating in living history programs. And in all honesty, I would have to go with the artist renditions. Now, it was never glamorous, and it was sometimes dangerous. Let's face it, if you're in a column and you're in a camp, the enemy attacks, being a woman is not necessarily going to save you. Being a child is not going to save you. And as was proven in 1791, on November 4th, in Western Ohio, a column led by General St. Clair at the Battle of the Wabash, 1,200 men-at-arms and about 200 women of the camp with children and sutlers were attacked in the morning by a force of Native Americans. The men suffered 97% casualties, of which 50% were killed. And of the some 200 some odd women and children that accompanied the army, all but 3 were killed. So this was not necessarily a safe activity. Even Martha Washington was at times a woman of the camp, however, and the officers loved it when she came around because it brought an air of sensitivity and gentility to an otherwise male-dominated environment. Now, Washington knew that he could not ban women and children from the army. In some cases, in many cases, the women depended on their husbands for their livelihood, their income, farmers' wives, merchants' wives, that could not afford to be left at home. And so they took themselves and their children and they accompanied the army. Now, Washington knew that they were going to be a drain on resources, and so he required that they perform useful functions. The regimental officers were mandated to keep track of the number of women attached to their regiment, their marital status, their health, and they had to perform useful functions in the camp, be it seamstresses, laundresses, cooks, performing fatigue duties. But bottom line is, they were not there for purposes of prostitution, which is the sad, sad storyline that has come down through history, that these women were a bunch of hookers. They were not. One of the more useful functions, active functions that they performed was nursing, helping to fight camp diseases as well as tend to the wounded. Here we have an image you can see of women nursing fallen militiamen during the course of battle. Now, one of the women that we'll talk about today in that nursing capacity is Abigail Hartman Rice. She was born Abigail Hartman. She and her family came from Rotterdam in 1750 when she was 8 years old aboard the vessel, the Royal Union. They came to Philadelphia with the immigrant's dream of a new life and a new land, the potential for success. And because it was Philadelphia, they were finally going to be able to get that cheesesteak sandwich. Now, as you can see here, there's a description of the voyage from Rotterdam to Philadelphia. It talks about vomiting, headaches, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy. It sounds like the contraindications you hear on commercials today for modern medicines. You know, the ones that say, if you're allergic to this medicine, don't take it, but how do you know you're allergic until you do? In any event, she married at age 16 to Zachariah Rice, and they moved to an area of Pennsylvania near Valley Forge. And so it was that in 1777, that their property was visited by General Anthony Wayne and also by George Washington and his entourage on the way to setting up camp in Valley Forge. Now, conditions in Valley Forge were horrible. Lack of food, lack of clothing, disease was rampant. Washington realized that in order to keep the healthy men healthy, he was going to have to separate out the sick from the camp. And so he contracted, among others, Zachariah Rice to build a military hospital, the first military hospital in Yellow Springs, Pennsylvania, near to Valley Forge. Zachariah built the hospital, and Abigail began with missions of mercy, bringing food and other comforts to the sick soldiers, and eventually wound up being a full-time nurse, along with other women. And as it came to pass, you know, Congress wasn't all that interested in getting the troops paid. They were even less interested in getting the nurses paid. Abigail Hartman Rice led a nurses' strike and petitioned Congress for back pay, better conditions in the hospital. And she was, in fact, successful along with her non-fellow nurses. Now, it would be nice to say that Abigail Hartman Rice had a happy outcome. Unfortunately, in her service at the hospital, she contracted typhoid fever, of which she died in 1789. Now, aside from her nursing duties, she obviously had a very busy private life. Her tombstone reads in part, "Some have children, some have none. Here lies the mother of 21. A little closer to home, you may be familiar with the Battle of Ridgefield and the burning of the supply depot in Danbury. So the person who rode the alarm to bring out the troops from over in Westchester and Dutchess County was Sybil Ludington, the female Paul Revere. When word reached her father, who was a colonel in the New York militia, the troops had to be called out, and you know, they weren't living in a barracks. They were living in their own homes, their own farms, their own businesses. So the word had to be spread. Sybil, then 16 years old, mounted her horse, took a stick that she would use to beat on the doors of the militiamen to get them to come out and join her father and head over to Danbury to push back the British, and also to prevent them from being able to return to New York City via the New York route down through Newburgh. One loyalist attempted to stop her. He was not successful. She rode a 40-mile circuit through the night, and by the time she was done, 470 men of her father's regiment had mustered at the house and made their way towards Danbury and Ridgefield. So I have to ask you, is it fair? Here's 16-year-old Sybil Ludington. She completed her ride. But unlike Paul Revere, who was captured, she does not get a poem. On the other hand, in 1936, road markers were put up by the DAR to mark the route that she rode. A statue went up, as you can see, to commemorate her ride. And as a fun fact regarding Paul Revere, you know, his story was not known until the latter part, the mid part of the 1800s when Longfellow, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, wrote the poem The Ride of Paul Revere. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's great uncle was a general in the New York militia by the name of Peleg Wadsworth. Peleg Wadsworth and Paul Revere were on a mission together to Castine, Maine, later in the war. And Revere behaved so badly as an officer and was taken to be more concerned with his own comforts than those of the men and his military assignment, that Peleg Wadsworth brought him up on court-martial charges, and Revere was eventually acquitted. But I can only imagine Peleg Wadsworth spinning in his grave knowing that his great nephew writes a poem to honor a guy that he despised. Now, one of the best documented but little known women of the American Revolution was Deborah Sampson, who served as a soldier disguised under the name of Robert Shurtleff. Now, Deborah Sampson, both are Old Testament names, which I kind of got fixated on. So I thought I'd share with you the biblical derivations of the two names. Deborah was one of the judges during the pre-monarchical Israelite period. She was both a military and a civil leader, and she proved to be very successful in war against the Canaanites. And a fun fact, the name Deborah translates as bee in Hebrew. And Samson was also an Old Testament judge of the Israelites, but ultimately proved to not be a great judge of women. He had great physical strength that he got through his hair, as we know from the Bible, but he could not keep a secret, and he should have learned to stay away from anyone with scissors. And of course, we got this great movie out of it. Now, Deborah was born 1760 in Plimpton, Massachusetts. Her family fell on hard times when her father abandoned the family, and she was indentured out at age 10. She was not only released from indenture with the family that she served, but she became part of the family, an honorary daughter, if you will. She went to school and taught school until she was age 21. She tried enlisting as a man early in 1782, but things did not work out the way she wanted to, and she wound up failing to report. She eventually successfully enlisted as Robert Shurtleff in 1782. She was posted to the Light Infantry Company of the 4th Massachusetts Regiment Continental Line. Now, the Light Infantry were special troops. They were given special duties, and they were drawn from the best members of the regiment. They had to be able to operate independently, not necessarily packed shoulder to shoulder in the lines firing mass volleys that you see, but they performed scouting duties, they screened the army, and were often at the forefront of any of the actions. Now, she was able to successfully hide her identity for a time, despite being wounded on multiple occasions. She suffered a blow to the head, which she nursed herself. She received a saber cut, which she was able to see to herself. On one occasion, she was struck with 2 musket balls on the frontier in Westchester County, and took herself to the surgeon's tent. And rather than have her true nature discovered, she slipped out of the surgeon's tent, but took a surgical instrument with her, went off to the woods, bit down on a stick. She was able to remove one of the musket balls herself. Now, mind you, there's no anesthesia. There's no morphine, anything like that. And so, aside from the pain from the musket ball, there was the pain of actually having to remove it by herself. She was not able to get the second one. It remained lodged in her body for the rest of her life, and it resulted in her walking with a limp. Finally, what happened is she contracted a fever in the camp. And while in a state of delirium, she was taken by her fellow soldiers to the surgeon's tent. And when the doctor started to undress the soldier, he discovered, it's a good thing to have medical knowledge, that this soldier had some stuff he shouldn't have and was missing some stuff that he should. But being a little bit on the progressive side, I guess, he decided that rather than have her taken, removed from the army, he took her into his home for her to recover, and she performed military duties there until he wound up reporting the situation to General Patterson, the commanding officer, who took her into his military family. She served out almost to the end of the war and received a pension for her service. She was named the official Massachusetts state heroine in 1982. In 1989, the statue of her honoring her wartime service, clad in her military coat but wearing a dress, was erected. Now, she and her husband, Mr. Gannett, moved to the town of Sharon, but her story is not over. In 1802, she had worked with a playwright and put together the first solo performance done by a woman in America. And she took this show on the road. She performed in New York, Philadelphia, Boston. In it, she would come out on stage dressed in her uniform of the 4th Massachusetts Light Infantry, performing the Manual of Arms, telling the story of Robert Shurtleff's wartime service. As she progressed through the story, she would gradually change from soldier to civilian until finally at the end of the show, she was standing there in her female civilian garb. So that's the story of Deborah Sampson. Probably one of the best documented but least known women of the American Revolution. And her full story can be found in a book called Masquerade by Alfred F. Young, which is still available today. Moving on. Anna Maria Lane from Connecticut. She enlisted in the Connecticut line as disguised as a man to serve alongside her husband. They served in an artillery unit working the cannons. She was wounded at the Battle of Germantown. Her husband's regiment was sent down south, where he transferred to the Virginia Dragoons and served with the Virginia Dragoons through the end of the war, and finally joined the local constabulary. She is the only woman to be granted a pension by the state of Virginia, which was given to her in 1808. Another woman disguised as a man also served as an artillerist. She dressed as a man to follow her man to war. Her regiment was sent south, served at the Battle of Savannah. She and her husband were both killed the same day, and her true gender was not discovered until after her death. Now, a lot of people think that, oh, Battle of Yorktown, 1781, that's the end of the war. Well, there were still other things going on. One of the last actions of the war took place on September 11, 1782, at Fort Henry, now the site of Wheeling, West Virginia. Now, Elizabeth Betty Zane, despite being from the backwoods, was no rube. She was educated in the East, and she came back to Wheeling, Fort Henry, just in time for her home to be laid siege by a force of Native Americans and British. Now, there was a blockhouse and a palisade, and all the settlers, when the attack came, ran to be in the fort. Now, they had an advantage in that they had a small cannon mounted on top of the blockhouse that they were able to fire into the enemy forces. It worked so well that the Native Americans and their British allies decided, well, we don't have a cannon, but we'll build one out of a tree. So they cut down a tree and hollowed it out, wrapped it in chains to keep it from exploding, loaded it with powder and ball, lit the match, and the gun exploded, killing and maiming the crew. So they decided that they weren't going to do that again, and they went back to a time-honored tradition of fooling white men. They sent some of the Native Americans went into the cornfield to set fire to the corn. The settlers sent out 40 men to chase them away, and they were lured into an ambush. So out of 40 men that they had, nearly 20 were slain. Worse yet, they started to run out of gunpowder. Now, the powder was in the Zane cabin about 50 yards from the fort. Betty's brothers and other men offered to make a run for it, but Betty had an argument that she should go that prevailed. Her argument was, you have not one man to spare, a woman will not be missed in the defense of the fort. 'Tis better a maid than a man should die. So 17-year-old Betty left the safety of the fort and made her way to the Zane cabin. Now, she was pretty much ignored by the enemy forces. She got inside with no problem. She filled her apron with gunpowder and started to make her way back to the fort. This time, the Native Americans and British realized that there's something going on, and they started to shoot at her, but she made her way back to the fort, distributed the gunpowder, and she had brought enough that they were able to hold off the enemy forces until relief arrived the next day. And the natives and the British went off to attack another outpost, and they were equally unsuccessful in that endeavor as they were at where Betty Zane was. Not to take anything away from the heroics of the men in the fort, but really the outstanding action of the time was what Betty did. And if you look at the historic marker, it seems that, well, at least she got an honorable mention down at the bottom. So Molly Pitcher, the heroine who wasn't. There are oodles, tons of pictorial and otherwise images of Molly Pitcher. Thereas these that you see in front of you, and these that you see in front of you, and these, and she's been a bas relief, and people think they've identified her well, and she's been a comic book and a graphic novel. She's been a brand of beer, a postage stamp, a bobblehead doll, a monument, a marker, and ultimately a rest stop on the New Jersey Turnpike. The thing is, she didn't really exist. First off, Molly was a common sobriquet for a woman. You know, like Australians call their women Sheilas. During the colonial period, women were known as Mollies. And Pitcher, because allegedly she brought one. But there were really two candidates for Molly Pitcher. One is Margaret Corbin. She served in the early part of the war. You know, Washington's been kicked off of Long Island at the Battle of Brooklyn. He's been pushed out of New York, and he's being pushed back up Manhattan Island. And what's now Fort Tryon Park at the Cloisters was really Fort Washington in 1776. Another case of a woman working field pieces with her husband. She took his place. And in the course of the battle, she was seriously wounded in the arm and breast and was disfigured for life. She was temporarily a prisoner of war of the British. She was released. She went to West Point, where she was assigned to the Invalid Corps, which was a mustering of wounded or sick soldiers who were well enough to perform light duties, but not well enough to go through the rigors of campaign and combat. Now, indications are that she dressed and served as a male. And at the end of hostilities, she received a soldier's pension and one complete suit of clothes out of the public stores, which had only men's clothing to distribute. So the possibility is this is another case of a woman disguised as a man. Now she moved up to Highland, New York. She was buried in the Highland Cemetery. In 1926, the DAR, with representatives from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, exhumed what were believed to be the remains of Margaret Corbin. Excuse me. In fact, a doctor at the site said, yes, these are the remains of a woman. So she was taken to West Point to be reinterred. And the story might have ended there, except in 2016, while working on some new graves, the grave of what was believed to be Margaret Corbin was disturbed, and coffin broke open. So her remains were taken and re-examined, and this time it was discovered that they were a man. Probably the remains of a male Revolutionary War soldier, but definitely not remains of a woman. And so whoever that soldier was, this unknown revolutionary soldier, his remains were reinterred, but the hunt for Margaret Corbin goes on. The other candidate is Mary Ludwig Hayes. Now, hers is the classic image loading the cannon at the Battle of Monmouth. Battle of Monmouth was exceedingly hot. How hot was it? Men were dying from heat stroke, is how hot it was. I mean, let's face it, they're in wool coats, all buttoned up, all the stuff the soldier hangs on them, in close contact with the soldiers around him. It was hot. I have done recreations of the Battle of Monmouth in my younger years under similar circumstances, and I really don't understand how anybody survived that at all. In any event, another case of replacing her man, loading the cannon. And at one point, as she stretched to load a round into the muzzle, the cannonball from a British cannon tore away the lower part of her dress, rather. Without missing a beat. And this was witnessed by Joseph Plum Martin of Connecticut. She said, "It's a good thing it didn't go any higher, or it might have carried away something else." She remained uninjured. She did receive a pension for her wartime service. I would like to tell you she had a happy life, but the man she married after the war was a louse. And the best thing he ever did for her was to abandon her. He wasted her wartime pension, and she wound up putting herself into service, working for families. Now she's buried among Rev War veterans, and even the Molly Pitcher statue locating her grave in Pennsylvania credits both women. Now, even though there was not a Molly Pitcher, there was a Moll Pitcher. Some of you may feel the need to put on your tinfoil hats for this one, because this is a little weird. Now, she was not born Moll Pitcher. She was born Moll Diamond in the area of Salem, Massachusetts, in Marblehead. She had certain abilities far beyond those of mortal women. Her grandfather was known as Wizard Diamond. He was involved in the shipping industry, but he had a talent. He would stand in the graveyards and be able to mentally reach out to ships at sea. And if they were lost at sea, he would be able to bring them in. So successful was he that sailors would refuse to go on board for voyages unless their ship got a clean bill of health from Wizard Diamond. Moll Pitcher exhibited, Pitcher being her married name, she exhibited her abilities in other ways. She was skilled in the art of tasseography, the art of reading tea leaves. She was a contemporary of General John Glover, of the Marblehead fishermen, the guys who pulled Washington's troops off of Long Island after the Battle of Brooklyn. She was well known in the area for her prognostications. When the British occupied Boston, officers like Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne and General Carleton would come and consult with her, but she was so shrewd that she was often able to get more information out of them than they were able to get out of her. She was said to be able to predict the outcome of lotteries. I don't know that she ever acted on those, it seems not, but people would come to her and say, we heard about this treasure, can you tell me where it's buried? And she would reply with, fool, if I knew that, would I tell you? In any event, the British evacuate Boston. And Glover is among the troops that are occupying it for the American side. Washington comes and Glover says to Washington, I've got somebody you need to meet. So the story is that Washington met with Moll Pitcher. And among her predictions in that private meeting was the outcome of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the ultimate success of the American Revolution, the rise of Washington to civilian leadership, horseless carriages, space flight, radio, solar power, submarines, and the eagle, despite what Franklin wanted, becoming the emblem of the new nation. Comes John Greenleaf Whittier, who writes a 90-stanza poem, not about the good stuff that Moll Pitcher did, but rather accusing her of witchcraft, being in league with Satan, that she was unattractive, that she was a hunchback, that she walked with a limp. None of this stuff was true. And in fact, and years later, Whittier would come to regret what he had written and kind of do his best to take it back. Oh, and also this book of Moll Pitcher's prophecies, if you're interested in reading those, they're available on Kindle through Amazon. Full disclosure, I hold no stock in Amazon. I'm not getting a penny out of this. Moving on. So this is really just an excuse to put up a picture of Natasha Fatale from Rocky and Bullwinkle, because at heart, I'm about 7 years old. But the background to this is guys, right? The hubris of guys thinking that women, servants, are unobservant, unintelligent, have no head for military matters, and so oftentimes feel free to discuss secret stuff in front of people that they think they don't need to worry about. There's this great scene in the movie, Civil War movie, The Horse Soldiers, based on Grierson's Raid, where John Wayne and William Holden are discussing their plans, and the Mrs. Confederate sympathizer and her slave are listening in on the other side of the door and catch everything. So women were involved in espionage on both sides, but I'm not going to talk about the ones on the British side. I'm going to talk about some of the ones on the American side. So we start with Anna Smith Strong and the Culper Spy Ring. Now, if you watch the AMC series Turn, that was based and set around the activities of the Culper Spy Ring. Anna and her husband operated a tavern in Setauket, Long Island. Setauket became a hotbed of espionage for the American side during the American Revolution. And they were part of the Culper Spy Ring, created by General Washington and headed by Benjamin Talmadge, originally from Long Island, but more lately a resident of Connecticut. Now, the story is that she used the patterns of how she hung up her laundry to inform rebel boat captain Caleb Brewster which of 6 coves to go to pick up the secret information to take back to Talmadge, to take back to Washington. The secrecy of the Culper Spy Ring was so secure that the people involved were not discovered as to their identities until the 1930s, when somebody was going through a trunk in Long Island, in an attic in Long Island, and found the papers of one of the Townsends, who was they were the main characters in the Culper Spy Ring. So this was definitely a very secret operation. And it operated successfully from about 1778 through the end of the war. It was not the only spy operation that Washington ran, but it was the largest and most successful. Now, one of the people in the Culper Spy Ring is only known as Agent 355. Now, the codes of the Culper Spy Ring, individuals were given numeric codes. For instance, George Washington, his identity code number was 711. So thank heaven for 711. Now, 355 could have been just a generic code number for a lady, or there is speculation it might have been a specific individual, but nobody knows who that is. She may have been a loyalist socialite who worked for the Americans. She might have been an actress who used her notoriety and acting skills to get information out of John Andre, who headed the British spy ring during the war. She may have been related to one of the other Townsends, but whoever she was successful, but we will never know who she is unless some other trunk in another attic comes to light. But so mythic has this figure become, she's become the subject of TV, graphic novels, and video games. An accidental spy was Lydia Darragh. This is a case where she overheard British officers making plans for an attack on Washington at White Marsh, near what's now Washingtonville, Pennsylvania. She made notes which she secreted in her needle purse and asked permission to leave Philadelphia to get food, because there were massive food shortages and you could get a pass to leave town to go out into the countryside and secure provisions and then come back. Well, what she did is she went to the Rising Sun Tavern and turned her notes over to Elias Boudinot, who was the American commissary of prisoners. He took the plans to American headquarters, and it mitigated the effectiveness of the attack on White Marsh. In fact, in the aftermath of the attack, when the British were doing their after-action report, Andre was noted to say to the effect that not only did it seem like they knew we were coming, but they knew what our plans were. So, Nancy Morgan Hart was the quintessential frontierswoman. Now, there's some speculation as to whether she was born in Pennsylvania or North Carolina. They're thinking maybe Pennsylvania, because there's a story that she was a cousin to General Morgan of Morgan's Rifles. But history tells us that she was illiterate, that she was raw-boned, marked by smallpox scars, but she was rugged, independent, an herbalist, a midwife, and oh, by the way, she was a crack shot. She would go out with her husband's militia unit, and they would post on one side of a river, and as enemy forces would cross the river, she would pick them off, being excellent as a sniper. So one day, while her husband is off doing militia stuff, 6 British soldiers show up, demand to be fed. They go out and they kill a turkey. They tell her, cook the turkey, give us whiskey. So she gives them food, she gives them drink, and gives them more drink and more drink. And while they're eating and drinking, she takes their muskets and slips them out the door to her waiting children. Finally, one of the soldiers sees what she's doing, jumps up, she grabs one of the muskets and shoots him dead. Another Britisher attacked her. She grabbed another musket, shot him too. The other 4 she held at bay until her husband came home with the militia regiment. Husband says, well, what do you want us to do with these guys? She says, I want them hung. He says, but they're in uniform. They should be taken as prisoners of war. She said, no, I want them hung. And you don't mess around with Nancy Morgan Hart. So the story is that they took them off and they hung the 4 of them and then buried all 6 bodies. And this was local and family lore until about 1912, 1913, when workers are digging a new railroad cut about a mile from where the Hart Ranch stood. And they find this grave. There's 6 bodies in it. 2 of them, well, they've got remnants of British uniforms and buttons. 2 of them have musket balls lodged in them, and the other 4, their necks are broken, their hyoid bones are broken as if they had been hung. And so what was local lore and family lore becomes fact. Mary Murray was a nice Quaker woman from Pennsylvania. She was kind of leaning towards the American side. Her husband was a loyalist, but he was a successful Philadelphia merchant. And he moved to New York because, you know, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. So he set up a very successful business. They built a nice house in what would become the Murray Hill section of New York. And when Washington is getting pushed up up along Manhattan, the British are coming up on the east side, and General Israel Putnam's forces are coming up on the west side. Now, there's no West Side Highway, so you know they've got a hard trek, but they're in danger of being cut off by the British. So they come across the Murray house, and they see the lovely Mrs. Murray and her lovely daughters. And Mrs. Murray says, oh, you poor British guys in those hot wool uniforms, would you like to pause and take some refreshment? And she tied them up long enough, entertained them long enough, that Putnam was able to get his column up the west side and rejoin Washington's army and avoid being captured. And our last story. The sister-in-law is Martin. The Martin family had 9 sons. 7 of them joined the revolutionary forces. 2 did not because they were too little to join. The 2 oldest sons married, and the sisters-in-law, they're getting tired of doing the woman at home rolling bandages, making cartridges, sewing uniforms. They wanted to be able to do something a little more active. And finally, opportunity presented itself. Word came through the militia grapevine that there was going to be a British dispatch rider guarded by 2 guards that were going to be coming through carrying important information. And sure enough, they hear these 3 riders ride by the house. The 2 Martin sisters-in-law run upstairs, grab men's clothing, disguise themselves as men, grab some pistols, take horses out of the stable, and being local, they know where the shortcuts are, and they figured the point where they would be able to cut off the British dispatch rider and his guards. They secreted themselves in some bushes, and sure enough, along come these 3 guys. The 2 women, disguised as men, jump out of the bushes, brandishing their pistols, forced the British to stop their horses, took their weapons, took the dispatches, and sent them on their way. Took the information, rode home, turned it over to militia courier to take to headquarters, put back on women's clothes, and were just sitting around doing nothing when there's a knock on the door. And who is it but 3 British guys? It's the dispatch rider and his 2 guards. And Mother Martin says, didn't you guys pass by here a little while ago? Yes, we did. Well, what happened? Well, we got ambushed. Oh, really? Yes, these 24 guys jumped out of the bushes and took our weapons and took stuff and made us run away. Well, what do you want? Well, we're just looking for some food and a place to spend the night. So they were put up in the barn, they were given some food, they were allowed to spend the night. But when they left the next morning, they did not realize that the 2 young women who had helped entertain them were the 2 young men who had ambushed them in the first place. And so that brings us to the end of this talk. And I hope you have enjoyed it. I will say in closing that in doing the talks that I do, I usually try and wind up saying something profound and pithy, but I think that the actions of all of these women and more that I haven't had the time to tell you about speak louder than any paltry thing that I could have to say.